The people of the United States are not one nation, despite what the Pledge of Allegiance might have us believe. Rather, the citizenry of the USA is comprised of multiple nations, that is, distinct peoples bonded by shared histories, cultures, or ancestries, and generally occupying a particular region. In short, a naturally manifested collective identity. If you've been with the channel for a while, what I just brought up should be nothing new to you, but for anyone joining us for the first time who might be thinking, well, Americans do have a collective identity, let's briefly reiterate something we've brought up before in several videos. There is no natural American identity which extends across the entirety of the United States. An American in Georgia is not the same as an American from Massachusetts, who's not the same as an American from Hawaii. American is nothing more than an imperial identity. It's an artificial title defined in this day and age by nothing more than a few ideas. You, sir, from Australia, from the Congo, from Iran, from Germany, can all equally become American if you believe in freedom, the Constitution, and the Founding Fathers. That's not how a nation works, that's how an empire works. Traditionally, an empire expands its territory through conquest, and the citizens inhabiting those conquered lands, who had been a nation of their own, are now made to relinquish or suppress their identity and conform to the imperial identity. You're no longer this, you must become a part of the empire. America hasn't outright conquered or annexed land in quite some time, but instead, and really across all of its history, it draws foreign nations to itself with the promise of opportunity and attempts to conform these desperate individuals into the singular American mold. But this doesn't work, and it never has. From the moment the United States was born, you already had multiple distinct nations within it, vying for power and ultimately splitting the country in two during the Civil War. Slavery was an irreconcilable difference between an urban, industrial, religiously pluralistic North and the more distinctly Baptist, agrarian, and rural South. These two halves of the country were living in dramatically different realities shaped by distinct histories, which ultimately led one side to see slavery as an irredeemable evil which needed to be ended, and the other side to see it as a normal part of life and even as an essential property right protected by the Constitution. Even by the standards of those who say the North and South were the same nation because they were both Anglo, not only does this dismiss distinct demographic circumstances both regions were under, the North receiving far more immigration from Germany and Ireland and developing a growing Catholic population, while the South, of course, had nearly as many African inhabitants as it had Anglos. But on top of that, the initial settlers of the northern and southern states didn't settle for the same reasons and didn't even come from the same parts of England, which, at the time of the American settlement, wasn't perfectly unified either, as we'd see just decades after American settlement when England had a civil war of its own. Circling back to the American Civil War, the North of course won, but the South remained culturally defiant. It was never assimilated, and several more nations have emerged within the country since then. To summarize all of this, the American people are not one nation. The American people are several nations in one country unified by the title of American, and despite that unifying title, these American nations are distinct from one another in their cultures, histories, values, lifestyles, etc., and interestingly enough, there are varying levels of consciousness or awareness of these identities, some being fully aware of their distinctiveness, but most being oblivious to it and wondering why the people in all the other parts of the country act differently from themselves. These American national differences, I believe, are important to promoting understanding in a very polarized and divided country, because this is much more tangible and identifiable than the broader American identity. Like, hey, I'm an American from New York, why do the Americans from Texas want things so different from what me and my neighbors want? We're all Americans, aren't we? We should all want the same thing, and what's good for us is good for you. This way of thinking is so obfuscating. But when you realize, oh, me and people like me have totally different histories, cultures, and lifestyles from the people in this part of the country or that part of the country, it makes sense why they like their politics and economics and even their social views the way they do instead of our own. So today we're going to go over a general list of how many American nations there are, what they are, along with a bit of their history. Stick around till the end because I want to hear your thoughts on this general breakdown, and especially if you want to help refine or add to it as well. Now just a moment, let's take a quick minute to shout out today's sponsor, World of Warships Legends, and they're actually partnering up with a charity today, which we'll talk more about toward the end. First, let's talk about the game itself. You might have heard about it before. This is a naval strategy MMO that you can play for free on mobile or right on your consoles, facing up against other players or the computer in PvP battles that can range from 9v9 to 4-team matchups. World of Warships of course prides itself on its detailed mechanics and ship models, the game featuring destroyers, battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers from 11 different countries, with the fleet expanding every few weeks. Now, of course, World of Warships has partnered up with the Battleship Texas Foundation to support the preservation and restoration of the USS Texas. Every cent from a purchase of the special charity DLC from August 8th to September 8th will go directly toward this real-life ship restoration. The DLC pack features an in-game version of the USS Texas, an American Commander crate, 15 American ARC camos, 15 rare battle boosters, and a token for a special mission. On top of that, World of Warships is hosting a raffle for a custom-made Xbox console featuring a real piece of the USS Texas ship. You can find additional details and start playing the game for free by following the link below in the description or in the comments section. Now, let's get back to the video. The first of our American nations is one of the very first to arrive in what would become the United States. The New Englanders are an Anglo-American people who owe their origins to the initial settlement of the Plymouth colony by the Puritans. While once the New Englander nation extended across the northeastern coast, reaching into areas as far as Delaware and even having small outposts in the southern colonies, today the extent of this nation is largely limited to the states of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, with minor bleed over into Massachusetts and New York. Beginning their history in the region as a highly moralistic and religiously congregationalist population, over time that religious profile has evolved, transforming this nation into one of, if not the most secular in the entire country. That being said, many of those initial Puritan values have carried over into the modern day, especially their close-knit nature, high emphasis on the value of personal education, support of strong local government and social infrastructure, as well as a general industrious and mercantile mindset. Having been subject to significant migration and overlap with the Anglo-Canadians across the border, that culture and its Anglican background have influenced the New England nation as well, additionally introducing some Catholic French-Canadian elements into the border regions of the state. One might say that on the continent, the New Englanders share the most in common with the Anglo-Canadians across the border, who in turn have influenced the closely related Western nation in the Pacific Northwest. Just south of the New England nation, we find a people I refer to as the Metropolitans, a nation defined by its ties to a heavily urbanized coastal environment, namely the combined Boston, Philadelphia, and New York metro areas. While urbanization tends to invite diversity in the United States, the metropolitan nation does share some common roots, namely the combined Italian, Irish, and Hispanic descendant populations, who are bound by a shared Catholic background and constitute a plurality across the coastal region and its interior suburbs. And while these three populations on their face appear distinct enough to constitute their own nations, heavy rates of intermarriage between the three suggest a strong proclivity for these Catholic populations to amalgamate. It is extremely common in this day and age to encounter a metropolitan who shares at least two of these backgrounds, and while the metropolitan population is also undergoing a process of secularization, even with its much higher levels of urbanization, it's not nearly as secular as the New England nation, and still sees Catholic ideals influence general morality and behavior, particularly the emphasis on strong authority, personal honor, maintaining community, and promoting the common good. Largely concentrated in the mid-Atlantic coast, minor outposts of this nation can be found in the upper south, parts of the Midwest, and across central and southern Florida. An additional dimension further uniting these populations is their distinct immigrant experience, each at one point facing severe ostracism, operating in the lowest, least glamorous rungs of the labor class, before gaining a foothold and achieving a stake in the country. This was experienced first by the Irish, then the Italians, the Puerto Ricans, and most commonly in the modern day, the Mexicans. Poles, Greeks, Jews, and other groups under similar conditions also occasionally blur into this nation as well, though not always. The southern nation is also among, if not the oldest of the American nations, defined by settlement waves in both Virginia and Carolina, the former a direct transplant from Britain and the other from the plantation colony of Barbados. The initially Anglican South quickly adapted to its decentralized rural environment, becoming dominantly Baptist. While this nation is largely of Anglo background, it is heavily intermingled with various other Brittonic groups over the years, with significant Scottish, Irish, Welsh, and Scots-Irish populations, much of the population having some level of mixture featuring these groups, and to a lesser extent some instances of mixture with the overlapping African-American population as well. Highly religious, the Baptist faith continues to directly influence Southern culture to this day, making it among the most socially conservative nations in the US, with a proclivity towards small government and self-sufficiency. With the rise of secularization and disputes over the centralized nature of the Southern Baptist Convention, many former Southern Baptists have begun identifying in the modern day as non-denominationals, though still generally holding to Southern Baptist values. The southern nation is also perhaps the most widespread nation in America, with major outposts reaching as far west as Arizona, into the interior of the country, and across various parts of the Midwest. Naturally, the aftermath of the Civil War led the southern nation to become more stalwart and firm in its identity, as well as highly skeptical of outsiders. Directly linked to the previous nation, the African American nation first arrived on the continent through the introduction of slavery. The experience of slavery has been particularly influential in shaping this nation and its sense of exploitation at the hands of the southern nation, spawning a general sense of distrust for authority and outsiders in general. With the practice of slavery having been most widespread throughout the Deep South, the African American nation can be found in greatest concentration in the region known as the Black Belt, including the city of Atlanta, Georgia, and the east bank of the Mississippi. Several outposts of this nation exist, with a major outpost in the greater DC-Baltimore area and minor outposts across several cities and southern communities. Also religiously Baptist, this nation broke away from the dominantly white Southern Baptist Convention, now largely belonging to the almost exclusively African American National Baptist Convention, which has been highly influential in developing the African American nation's values, which, while deriving in part from Southern values and while still being socially conservative, places a greater emphasis on female participation in positions of power and maintains looser restrictions on its congregations than the Southerners. Another early nation, the Appalachians are arguably the product of the first true immigrant wave to the British colonies. That is, not being an initial settlement party, but individuals traveling to pre-existing settlements for the sake of finding better opportunities, though very quickly they would become frontiersmen. Originating from the arrival of German and Ulster Scot or Scots-Irish Presbyterians and Lutherans, many initially found their way into America through the religiously pluralistic colony of Pennsylvania, before settling deeper into the frontier lands where they hoped to find unclaimed land that would earn them higher status in the New World. However, unlike the fertile lowlands of the coastal South, the mountainous terrain settled by the Appalachians was far less conducive to large-scale agriculture. Much like the Southerners, the harsh conditions of rural life would strain Presbyterian tradition and led the Appalachians to become largely Baptist, as the decentralized nature of the faith, along with its low barrier to entry for clergymen, made its practice far more accessible. Over time, despite national developments, the region of Appalachia remained fairly poor and underdeveloped, and as such, the Appalachian people have become associated with images of hillbillies and poor country folk. The shared experience of living under these circumstances and enduring for the sake of freedom and independence provided by the mountains of Appalachia have made the Appalachian people a particularly hardy and proudly self-sufficient folk. The Ohioans are an evangelical, mixed German-American population concentrated along the Ohio River and buffered to the north by the Midwestern population around the Great Lakes. Religiously a menagerie of various Protestant faiths, from Lutherans to Methodists to Baptists, they're all bonded by a shared evangelical interpretation of Protestantism, embracing far more piety, faith, and spiritualism than more orthodox mainliners. These Ohioans, like the Appalachian people, also owe their origins to the state of Pennsylvania, which early on quickly became an attractive hub for German immigrants who rapidly expanded outward into the interior Midwest, particularly the fertile lands along the Ohio River, where they regularly intermingled with Anglo-Americans both from the north and south, not to mention the Appalachians, contributing to their diverse religious profile and ancestral background. The lands along the Ohio River were significantly more fruitful than the hilly and mountainous country of Appalachia, allowing the Ohioans to thrive as farmers and landowners while the Appalachian nation struggled. This trend continued for decades, even as urbanization drew more German Americans to the developed coasts of the Great Lakes, the risk-averse traditions of the Protestant Germans leading to a strong belief in keeping land in the family and in turn using that land to provide for one's family. Contrasting the evangelical German Ohioans are the predominantly Catholic and mixed German Midwesterners. Having been drawn to the cities of the Great Lakes, initial waves of Catholic Germans were far less risk-averse than their Protestant rural counterparts and actively engaged in American political life, at times even with radical positions. Many of these Germans having arrived following the European revolutions of 1848, they brought with them many of these same ideologically radical sentiments previously uncommon in the United States, becoming particularly active in challenging the nativism of the Anglo-North and the slave economy of the South. Initial hostilities existed with the early Irish Catholics settling in these same cities, but much as in the case of the Metropolitans, intermarriage and cultural amalgamation began, later extending to include French Canadian and Slavic Catholic populations settling in the same region. Truly coming into their own at a time when industrialization was reaching its height and the railroads and industries of the Midwest became the new heart of American power, the Midwestern nation experienced something of a rapid cultural genesis which remained strong until the Great Wars, when German-American culture was suppressed out of fear that the population was sympathetic to Germany, and when the politicians of the Midwest were crippled by the perspective that their isolationism was a sign of lacking patriotism. A final blow would be dealt to the Midwestern nation by the exportation of domestic industry, leading many of these formerly industrial cities in an economic slump. This rapid rise and fall has contributed to the shaping of the Midwestern mindset, activist but cautious, ambitious but fearful. And that political proclivity toward labor politics first introduced by the German Catholics remains a major facet of Midwestern politics to this very day. This nation also maintains a major outpost in the form of St. Louis, across urbanized parts of the Ohio River Valley, Alaska, and of course parts of Texas. The Scandamerican nation, a nation descendant from the Lutheran Scandinavian immigrants, followed a similar course to the Ohioans, though far later down the timeline and under conditions which led to a far greater isolation. Settling in greatest concentration along the upper Midwest, the Scandamericans sought land acquisition for the purpose of family farming, maintaining a much more humble and somber character than their zealously pious Ohioan and politically radical Midwestern counterparts, both as a carryover of somber Scandinavian mannerisms of the time, as well as a result of the fact that the land of the upper Midwest was more remote and underdeveloped than those of the lower Midwest, making life in the region more laborious and difficult. Though this being said, the Scandamericans did share in the Midwestern political idealism, often favoring social and labor reform, but preferring to tackle such things at the local level than at the national level, and with much more passivity than the aggressive Midwesterners. The Heartlanders are another German-American nation. However, unlike the Ohioans, the Heartlanders are distinctly of a mainline Protestant background, chiefly the United Methodist Church and to a lesser extent the Episcopal Church. As that religious orientation might suggest, the Heartlanders are significantly more anglicized and assimilated into the old Anglo-American culture than their eastern counterparts, as the isolated nature of life in the interior of the country would have cut off most access to native German culture accessible to the more thoroughly developed Midwesterners and Ohioans. Many Heartlanders owe their origins to the Ohioans, and this nation might be considered an offshoot, though an additional major contributor to the creation of this nation was the arrival of a wave of Volga Germans in the late 18 and early 1900s, as well as several pre-existing Anglo-American communities in the region from the north and south. While most Heartlanders are largely of German-American background, like the Ohioans, they have intermingled significantly with local Anglo-American populations, albeit with a likely higher German to Anglo ratio than the Ohioans. That is to say, the Heartlanders probably have a lot more German ancestry than the Ohioans do, despite having adopted more Anglo-American customs. An offshoot of the New England nation, the Mormons began their history on the continent with the establishment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, gaining a large number of Anglo-American followers with later German and Danish additions, and facing significant persecution across the country which drove them further and further westward, eventually settling in the land surrounding the Great Salt Lake where they carved out a home for themselves. The values of the LDS Church were fundamental to the divergence and development of the Mormon nation from their New Englander roots, but beyond this was that experience of persecution and tremendous sense of otherness emphasized by their arduous trek and exile to the Great Basin. A relatively recent nation, and arguably one that is still undergoing its distinct cultural genesis, the Latino Americans or Neo-Texans are the Hispanic American descendant population largely concentrated in the Southwest, which can trace much of their ancestry to various parts of Central America and Mexico especially. Seeing a rapid rise in their population and having arrived in the region at an opportune time to take advantage of the economic growth experienced by the Sun Belt region, the Neo-Texan nation has quickly gained a prominent position in American life. I will emphasize that this nation is likely yet to fully achieve a distinct cultural genesis, though given demographic trends, it's virtually assured that the Hispanic descendant population in the US won't be going anywhere, and we can assume that they will develop into a distinct American nation or nations of their own. I have chosen to refer to this potential nation as Neo-Texan based on the interesting phenomenon of significant intermingling between newly arrived Latino populations and much of the southern nation, particularly in places like Texas. We have also seen this to a lesser extent with the Mormon nation in places like New Mexico and Colorado. Counterparts to the New Englanders on the East Coast, the Westerners are another predominantly secular Anglo-American nation influenced by cross-border migration from Canada, albeit experiencing far less economic prosperity than their more established East Coast relatives. This being said, they are far more widespread across the West Coast as opposed to the New Englanders who have been confined to a corner of the Northeast. These two factors may actually connect in the fact that while New England was very thoroughly developed and settled, such was not the case for the Northwest. These populations were concentrated in only a few major cities, and interior development was relatively minor. Settlement from the regions of New England and the Midwest, and to a lesser extent parts of the Western South, constituted the ancestral foundations for the Westerners, particularly adherence to mainline Protestant churches, which over the years secularized or lost followers generation after generation, making this one of the most irreligious nations in the US. I had briefly debated whether or not to include this population as a nation, given that their history overlaps significantly with the Westerners. However, like the Southerners and Appalachians, the environment and lifestyle occupied by this nation, what we might call the Montanans, not to mention their history and interaction with other nations, has contributed to reshaping them into something fairly distinct from their brothers on the coast. Having been the product of settlement from New England, the Midwest, and Western South, those who chose to settle in the Rockies rather than trek further to the coast were initially motivated by prospects of resources, land for homesteading, and in some cases just felt it too difficult and unnecessary to go further west. This mindset naturally gave way to a far different lifestyle than that of the increasingly urban and mercantile coast out west. Ranching and mining instead became staples for what would develop into the Montanan nation. Like their coastal counterparts, the Montanans were also subject to significant secularization, and while significantly less religious than the nations of the Ohioans and Southerners, the decentralized and largely rural character of the region has allowed for stronger branches of mainline Protestantism to survive among the Montanans. Aside from their predominantly Anglo roots, because of their location, many Montanans have also significantly intermingled with German-American groups like the Heartlanders and to a lesser extent various Amerindian tribes present in the region. This nation, along with the Westerners and Midwesterners, see a continuity of their population up into Alaska, where over time this population might develop into its own distinct nation. The Southwest Amerindian tribes are perhaps the greatest concentration of the Amerindian population in the country, and though holding varying origins, the Amerindians of the Southwest, along with various other scattered populations across the country, have formed a unified, overarching Amerindian identity defined by their pre-Columbian history on the continent and their struggle to maintain their culture and land against incursions by the European settlers. Finally, the last major nation we'll explore is the Hawaiians or Neo-Hawaiians. The isolated nature of the Hawaiian Islands, along with their diverse history, has led to a fairly distinct instance of cultural amalgamation between the native Hawaiian inhabitants of Polynesian background, Anglo and German settlers from across the US, but especially from the West, as well as a large number of East Asian settlers, particularly of Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino background. While the Neo-Hawaiian nation is a relatively new one, the nature of Hawaii as an isolated island chain places it and its population under utterly unique circumstances to those on the mainland, accelerating the development of a distinct national identity. And there we have the 15 or so major nations of America. Of course, there are smaller nations with totally distinct identities who don't perfectly fit into any of these larger nations, see the Acadians and Cuban Americans for instance, but this is a good general breakdown of those major people groups in the United States. Once again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.